Trauma wing of Ashford Memorial Hospital moved like a machine that never slept, and Sarah Coleman had learned within her first week that the fastest way to survive there was to become invisible. She arrived before dawn, clocked out after dusk, and spoke only when spoken to. The other nurses noticed her competence but not her presence. She restocked supply carts before anyone asked. She caught a dosage error on a chart that a senior physician had signed off on, corrected it quietly, and never mentioned it to a soul. She was, in the words of one charge nurse, efficient but kind of a ghost. Nobody knew where she had trained. Nobody knew why a woman with such precise hands, and such a steady voice under pressure, had shown up at a mid-sized regional hospital instead of somewhere prestigious. When they asked, she smiled politely and changed the subject. When they pushed, she found a reason to leave the room. Dr. Marcus Webb, the head of the ER, had hired her on a temp contract 3 months earlier because she'd aced every technical question he'd thrown at her, and because, frankly, they were short-staffed and desperate. He didn't dig into her background. He didn't have time to. Nobody did. What nobody in that hospital knew was that Sarah Coleman had not always been Sarah Coleman in the way they assumed. 6 years earlier, she had been a combat medic attached to a special operations unit, the kind of unit whose deployments were never published and whose casualties were never named in the news. She had pulled men out of collapsed buildings while gunfire cracked overhead. She had held pressure on a wound with one hand and called in coordinates with the other. She had lost people, 2 good people, people whose faces still visited her in the quiet hours before sunrise. When her enlistment ended, she didn't come home to parades. She came home to silence, to a country that didn't ask what she'd seen, to a civilian world that had no framework for what she'd carried. So she buried the uniform in a closet, buried the medals in a drawer, and became deliberately, quietly, a nurse who kept her head down and her past sealed shut. She told herself it was better this way. Nobody needed to know. Nobody needed to look at her differently, to treat her like a curiosity or a hero when all she wanted was to do her job and go home. That Tuesday started like any other. The ER was moderately full, a broken wrist, a child with a fever, an elderly man complaining of chest pain who turned out, thankfully, to have indigestion. Sarah moved through her rounds with the same clipped efficiency she always did, checking vitals, updating charts, speaking softly to frightened patients in a voice that somehow made even the worst news feel survivable. Around 2 in the afternoon, one of the ER techs, a younger man named Jerome, noticed her hand shaking slightly while she prepped in 4-line. "You good?" he asked. She nodded, didn't elaborate, and moved on to the next bed. Nobody thought anything of it. Everybody's hands shook sometimes. The job did that to you. At 3:47 p.m., the first sound reached them. A low, distant thrum that most people in the building mistook for construction equipment or a passing truck. But Sarah's head snapped up before anyone else's did. Her body went rigid in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. The sound grew, resolved itself, became unmistakable. Rotor blades cutting the air in that particular rhythmic beat that civilians rarely hear up close and that veterans never forget. A Black Hawk helicopter was descending toward the hospital's helipad, and it was not a scheduled medevac. The dispatch board hadn't flagged an incoming transport. Nurses and doctors began crowding toward the windows, murmuring, some pulling out phones to record. Dr. Webb jogged toward the intake desk, demanding to know if anyone had gotten a call. Nobody had. Sarah stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the sound to fully register, long enough for 6 years of careful, deliberate distance to crack down the middle. Then, without a word to anyone, she walked toward the ambulance bay doors. Jerome called after her, asking where she was going, but she didn't answer. Outside, the wind from the rotors whipped her scrub top against her body as the massive aircraft settled onto the pad, its engine screaming down to a lower pitch. The side door slid open. For soldiers in full combat gear stepped down first, forming a loose perimeter with the practiced ease of men who had done this 100 times in far more dangerous places than a hospital parking lot. Behind them came a fifth figure, older, silver at the temples, moving with the unmistakable bearing of senior command. He wore a uniform heavy with insignia that most of the hospital staff wouldn't have known how to read, but anyone who'd served would have recognized instantly. This was not a low-ranking officer. This was someone whose name carried weight in rooms most people never entered. The staff who had gathered at the windows and in the doorway went quiet. uncertain what they were witnessing, half expecting a mass casualty event, half expecting some kind of security threat. Dr. Webb pushed forward, already rehearsing the questions he'd need to ask. Who authorized this landing? Was there a patient? Did they need to activate a trauma team? But before he could speak a single word, the commander's eyes moved past him entirely, scanning the small crowd gathered at the entrance, searching for something, or someone specific. And then his gaze landed on Sarah, standing perfectly still in her wrinkled scrubs, her hospital badge still clipped to her chest, her hands trembling now for an entirely different reason than exhaustion. The commander's face changed. Recognition swept across it, followed by something that looked almost like disbelief, and then, unmistakably, emotion he was fighting to keep off a face trained for decades to show nothing. He walked forward, his soldiers parting to let him pass, and stopped 3 feet from her. The entire ambulance bay had gone silent except for the winding down whine of the helicopter's engines. Every nurse, every doctor, every tech who had ever walked past Sarah Coleman without a second glance was now staring, transfixed, waiting to understand what they were seeing. Then the commander raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Jerome, standing near the doors with his mouth slightly open, would later say it was the quietest sound he'd ever heard in a building that loud. The sound of a senior military commander saluting a nurse nobody in that hospital had ever thought twice about. Dr. Webb's clipboard slipped from his fingers and clattered against the pavement, and still nobody moved to pick it up. Sarah stood there for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes glassy, and then almost instinctively, her own hand rose to return the gesture. The muscle memory of a life she tried so hard to leave behind. Nobody in that doorway understood yet what this meant. But every single one of them understood in that instant that the quiet nurse who restocked carts and never spoke about herself was not who they thought she was. Not even close. The commander lowered his hand and closed the remaining distance between them. And for a moment it seemed as though he might embrace her, but he stopped himself, some old instinct of protocol holding him back even here, even now. "Captain Coleman," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence of the ambulance bay. The words landed like a small detonation among the hospital staff. Captain. Not just a veteran, not just prior service. An officer, and one this man had traveled specifically to find. "Sir," Sarah answered, her voice steadier than her face suggested she felt. "It's been a long time." 6 years, he said. 6 years, and I still owe you a conversation I never got to finish. Dr. Webb, recovering his composure enough to step forward, asked cautiously whether there was a medical emergency, whether the hospital needed to prepare a trauma bay. The commander turned to him with the polite but firm authority of a man used to being obeyed without explanation, and said simply that there was no emergency, that he had come, personally, out of respect, to deliver something that could not wait any longer and could not be handled through the mail or a phone call. He gestured to one of the soldiers behind him, who stepped forward carrying a small case, the kind used for ceremonial presentations. The bay was dead silent now except for the shuffle of hospital staff pressing closer. Phones raised, disbelief written across every face. The commander explained, in a voice pitched for the small crowd as much as for Sarah herself, that 6 years earlier, during an operation that would never appear in any public record, then Lieutenant Sarah Coleman had been the medic attached to his unit when their convoy was ambushed in a mountain pass that offered no cover and no easy extraction. 2 of his men had gone down within the first 90 seconds. One with a chest wound that should have killed him before help arrived. Sarah had run through active fire, not walked, not crawled, but run to reach him, had performed field triage under conditions that by every normal military standard should have gotten her killed alongside him, and had kept that soldier alive for the 11 minutes it took for the extraction bird to reach them. The soldier had survived. He had a wife now, and 2 children who existed because a 26-year-old medic had decided that regulation caution mattered less than a heartbeat. She refused to let stop. But the story didn't end there, the commander continued, and this was the part that had haunted him for 6 years. In the chaos of the extraction, in the confusion of a unit that had taken heavy casualties and a command structure that was reorganizing on the fly, Sarah's own actions that day had never been properly documented. The paperwork had been lost, misfiled, buried under the churn of a war that produced more heroism in a single afternoon than most bureaucracies could process in a year. By the time anyone realized the oversight, Sarah had already separated from service, had already vanished into civilian life without a forwarding address that anyone thought to chase down. The commander had spent years on and off trying to track her down, not for ceremony, not for headlines, but because a debt like that doesn't simply expire when the paperwork gets lost. A soldier's life had been saved, and the woman who saved it had never been formally recognized for it, had never even been thanked in the way the moment deserved. He opened the case. Inside, resting on dark blue fabric, was a medal that most of the hospital's staff didn't recognize by sight but understood immediately by the reverence with which it was presented. A decoration for valor, the kind that isn't handed out for competence or diligence but for the specific, terrifying choice to run toward danger when every trained instinct says to hold position. "This should have found you 6 years ago," the commander said, lifting it from the case. "I am not going to let another year pass pretending that oversight was acceptable." He pinned it to her scrub top himself, his hand surprisingly gentle for a man whose bearing radiated command, and when he stepped back, he saluted her again, and this time every soldier behind him did the same, for sharp, synchronized gestures of respect aimed at a nurse in wrinkled blue scrubs standing in a hospital parking lot. The hospital staff, still frozen in the doorway, began to understand in pieces what they were witnessing. Not a security incident, not a medical emergency, but 6 years of unspoken sacrifice finally being brought into the light. Jerome would later admit he had goosebumps down both arms. Dr. Webb picked up his fallen clipboard without ever taking his eyes off the scene, as though looking away might make it stop being real. Sarah stood there, metal catching the afternoon sun, tears finally breaking free and tracing down a face that had spent 6 years perfecting the art of showing nothing at all. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying from the sheer, overwhelming release of being seen, truly seen, after so long spent making herself small enough that nobody would ask the questions she wasn't ready to answer. In the weeks that followed, the story of the quiet nurse and the Black Hawk landing spread through the hospital, and then, inevitably, beyond it, though Sarah herself never sought the attention and deflected most interview requests with the same quiet discomfort she'd always shown when people tried to look too closely at her past. But something had shifted. She no longer arrived before dawn just to avoid conversation. She started slowly, telling pieces of her story to the co-workers who'd worked beside her for months, without knowing the weight she carried. Dr. Webb, who had once seen her only as a reliable temp hire, began introducing her to new residents as one of the finest clinicians and finest human beings I have ever had the privilege of working with. And he meant every word of it. The soldier whose life she'd saved eventually visited the hospital himself, bringing his wife and his 2 children, and the sight of that small family standing in the same ambulance bay where the helicopter had landed became, for the staff who witnessed it, more moving than the ceremony itself had been. Sarah Coleman never stopped being quiet. That part of her nature hadn't changed and never would. But quiet, the hospital staff learned, is not the same as small, and unnoticed is not the same as unremarkable. Sometimes the person restocking the supply cart without a word, the one who never mentions where she trained or what she's seen, is carrying a story large enough to bring a military commander across the country and a helicopter down onto a hospital roof. The lesson stayed with everyone who witnessed it that Tuesday afternoon. Pay attention to the quiet ones. You never know whose sacrifice is waiting behind the silence, and you never know when the sky itself might open up to finally give them the recognition they never asked for but always deserved. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button, because there are so many more stories like Sarah's waiting to be told, stories of quiet heroes hidden in plain sight, and you won't want to miss a single one.